Good afternoon. I would like to welcome all of you, especially our dear panelist, Teresa Fallon, Director of Brussels-based Center for Russia, Europe, and Asia Studies, and Justyna Szczublik, Deputy Head of Research Office at PISM and our China analyst. Thank you both one more time for accepting our invitation. I'm welcoming you all on behalf of the Polish Institute of International Affairs Brussels office. I'm Lukasz Jurczyn, and I have the pleasure to manage it. And I would like to thank in particular Teresa Fallon for this first occasion for cooperation between our research institutes at the Brussels level. I hope that we're going to have more occasions for common projects in the future. And worth noting, this is our second debate on China. We spoke in a stationary offline mode in January, so it was definitely far more fortunate for public events pre-COVID era. And we talked also about the EU-China relations, but at the sub-national dimension. And today, I'm very glad that we will have this discussion with so good specialists on the issue. We will focus on more global, more urgent dimension of this future relation. In addition, by analyzing the impact of the last US presidential elections. So before giving the floor to our dear moderator, to Damian Wnukowski, who at PISM is the head of Asia Pacific program, last technical remark to our participants. As it was mentioned in the program, in order to ask your questions, please leave it in the question and answers Zoom mode, and do not leave it within the chat. So only these questions from the Q&A window will be visible to our moderator, and they will be taken into consideration. Finally, I'm giving the floor to Damian, who will kick off our debate, and I'm sure that we're going to have a fascinating discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Lukasz. Good afternoon, everyone. I have a privilege to host today's discussion on a very important topic for the EU, but also I think for the global order, which is the EU-China relations, but in the context of one of the most prominent political events of this year, which is the US presidential election. It's been a year, sorry, it's been a month, I'm very sorry, since the American people chose their president, and there will be a change in the White House. Joe Biden will replace Donald Trump as the president of the United States. And the whole world is now watching, like experts, but not only, also politicians and public opinion, are watching closely at the creation of the US administration, the people who will shape the US policy in coming months and years, and will trying to figure out what this US foreign policy will look like, especially in relations with two crucial partners for the US, which is EU and China. Between those two partners, EU and China, in 2020 we celebrate the 45th anniversary of establishing the diplomatic relations. But in fact, there is not so much to celebrate, given, of course, the pandemic situation, but also the deteriorating or very strained relations between those two partners in recent years, especially since 2019, when the EU named China as a systemic rival and presented more tough stance on China than in the past years. Of course, pandemic and the Chinese activities during last months, given the mass diplomacy and all those disinformation features which happened in relations with the EU, but also the development of situation in Hong Kong or Xinjiang, that all of those issues affected the EU-China relations, which are very complex, we can say, in present time. So today we will discuss how the change in the White House, how the US foreign policy under Biden administration will also affect the EU-China relations. What is the future of EU-China relations in the coming years, and what the Biden administration, how Biden administration and their moves can affect those bilateral relations. And we have two distinguished panelists which will share their views on those issues with us. Teresa Fallon, which is the director and founder of the Center for Russia, Europe, and Asia Studies, and Justyna Szczudlik, deputy head of research and the China analyst in PISM. We will divide our meeting in 3 parts. The first one will be the presentations, about 10 minutes which will be delivered by our panelists on their views of EU-China relations and the future US policy towards those two partners. Then I will try to get to start the discussion with some questions, and of course I encourage all our participants on the YouTube and our viewers to ask questions in the chat box, as Łukasz mentioned. So we'll try to touch during this hour as much issues as we can. Of course, it's a very broad scope, but I hope that the discussion will be very fruitful and deep. So first, I will pass the floor to Teresa for her introductory remarks. Teresa, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. It's such an honor to be here. Thank you very much to the organizer, PISM. I'm so delighted that Krias, we're working together on this, and it's wonderful to be reconnected with Justyna, which we've been on panels in the past, specifically at the Warsaw Security Forum. So I'm very honored to be here. And as Damien mentioned, today is 1 month since the US election, and we've seen a lot of activity in Brussels. But to talk about the future of the EU-China relationship, I want to first briefly look back on how it has evolved over the years. So back in 2003, we saw the comprehensive strategic partnership in the wake or the aftermath of the Iraq War. And we saw this kind of move that when Europe was unhappy with the United States, they tended to reach out towards China. So that happened in 2003. Then there was kind of a brief honeymoon period between the EU and the PRC. There was a great desire to lift the arms embargo, which is actually still in place after the Tiananmen Square massacre. And what happened then, it was replaced, the honeymoon period was replaced with a period of growing awareness. So Europeans wanted market access, they were concerned about technology transfer, and we saw in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, increased foreign direct investment from China in Europe, which was initially welcomed, but we saw a great deal of investment in the commanding heights, for example, electrical grids, port infrastructure, and this caused some security concerns over time. And in addition to that, we find competition with China in areas like Africa. EU loans or even grants came with strings attached, whereas Beijing didn't have any strings attached. So this led to kind of a Europe loss of influence in Africa. All right, and then of course we saw the Belt and Road Initiative, Xi Jinping's signature foreign policy move, and all roads actually do lead to Europe. Although it has been slow to be taken up in Europe, we saw a sub-regional grouping that actually predates the Belt and Road Initiative in Central and Eastern Europe, initially called the 16+1. With the addition of Greece last year, it's now called the 17+1. So it starts really with Piraeus port in Greece, up through Central and Eastern Europe, all the way to the Baltic. So it's an interesting land-sea corridor that China has invested in. Now there's been some promise fatigue in the region. It's made up of 11 EU member states and 5 possible accession states. The bulk of the investments go to the non-EU member states, and we've seen a concentration in Serbia. So this might lead to what some have called a Balkan backdoor. Last year, EU official commented that they had overestimated Russia's influence in the region and underestimated China's influence. So they're kind of slowly waking up to China's creeping footprint in the region. And then we've seen this kind of naive no longer. This all happened in 2019, pre-COVID-19. So we already saw a decline. If you look at Pew Research studies, the public opinion across Europe, the more Europeans came in touch, in contact with China, the less they liked it. So it was already on a downward trajectory, opinion towards China, pre-COVID-19. So this idea of naive no longer was instituted in the new EU communication on China, also issued in 2019, March, right before the EU-China summit. It introduced this kind of three ways of looking at China as a competitor, a partner, and also a systemic rival. And this language, systemic rival, it was the first time it was used. And of course, this caused great consternation to Beijing. Since COVID-19, we see what High Representative Joseph Borrell has described a battle of narratives. So the EU felt really under siege from the way mask diplomacy was being conducted by Beijing across Europe. Italy was, of course, the first country in Europe to suffer from COVID-19, and the initial response from other EU member states wasn't very strong. China stepped in, and there was a great appreciation. A friend in need is a friend indeed. But this kind of mask diplomacy quickly morphed into what has been described as wolf warrior diplomacy. So Wolf Warrior is a film, a very popular film in China about Chinese, it's like a shoot 'em up in Africa, and eventually the protagonist kills an American mercenary, and it's very, the most popular film in China. So the language of Chinese diplomats in Europe, for example, in Sweden, the Chinese ambassador declared, "We have guns for our enemies and wine for our friends," to show that they were unhappy with the Swedish government's behavior in regard to Gui Minhai, a kidnapped Hong Kong bookseller who also is a Swedish citizen. So there's been friction with various EU member states. We've even seen Germany, which China carefully cultivates good relationships with, because Germany is clearly the biggest investor of European member states in China. And the next 5 EU member states combined don't even equal the level of Chinese-German trade. So Germany is a key country in all of this. And the timing of your conference today is perfect, because yesterday it was issued the new forward-looking transatlantic agenda. So this is Brussels' attempt to set out markers on how they want to work with the next Biden administration. I don't think it's any surprise to many people across Europe. There was a big sigh of relief in many capitals when Biden was named president-elect. It has been a rocky period for some EU member states under the Trump administration. As long as I've been following this, I've never seen transatlantic relations at such a low. Donald Trump had described Europe as a foe, even worse than China. And I think many capitals and officials were very concerned about the frictions that were happening in the relationship. But alternatively, if you really look at the ground, there's actually some more US activity than in the past. So it was also the way it was packaged. And of course, there was much cooperation at other levels of government. So how does the future look now under a Biden administration? One of the clear issues, I think, that we've seen with the NATO meeting held earlier this week, China is on the agenda. So NATO has had a period of reflection after Macron had declared NATO dead. So they had this reflection. And even yesterday, High Representative Borrell spoke at this NATO meeting. So we're seeing a closer conversation between NATO and the EU institutions, which we really didn't see in the past. And I think that this is a positive direction. And traditionally, Europe tends to think of China as far away, not my problem. But we've seen with the building of a base in Djibouti, the Arctic Silk Route, and also the pandemic, COVID-19 really makes the whole public aware of what's going on with China. What happens in China affects everyone's life here in Europe as well. So I think that there will likely be a honeymoon period with Biden. Many people are relieved that they don't have another 4 years of the Trump administration from a European perspective. And, but I think one of the most important areas will be digital. connectivity, digital global governance. Europe wants to remain a rule maker in this area rather than a rule taker. But since they have limited access to a modern artificial intelligence, all of these large technological forums, it will be harder, I think, to even regulate them, because the speed of technological change is so rapid that unless you're actually there on the floor of this, it's hard to regulate it from the outside. So I think that there are great attempts being made, and they just published, the EU just published a paper 2 weeks ago on this. I wonder how much longer they will be able to continue to do this. And in addition, in a post-COVID-19 economic landscape, there is increased desire to tax US platforms like Amazon, for example. And this, I suspect, will cause great friction in the US-European relationship. The idea of a digital, clean digital approach that was promoted by Pompeo, I expect that this will continue. And we've seen, even though tensions were really tight between Europe and the US, it was actually High Representative Borrell which suggested with Secretary of State Pompeo to have an EU-US dialogue on China. So this happened even under the Trump administration, which pretty much is a barometer of how desperate Europe was in regard to cooperating with the US on China. They have the same analysis of China as a threat, as a systemic rival, but the question remains, how do they solve this problem? And of course, European businesses feel sandwiched between PRC and the US, and how they will be able to do that. And the last issue, I think, that China is holding out as a carrot to Europe is the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment. They had their virtual summit, and actually there was no progress made. So this was promised to Europe last year in April 2019, that they would make progress, that it would be completed by the end of 2020. But in some respects, that could have been a tactic in order to show the US during their phase one trade negotiations with the United States that they had a card to play in Europe. So I think that these are issues that will remain on the table, and I look forward to Justina's analysis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Teresa. Thank you for mentioning a couple very important issues like the involvement of NATO in this trilateral relations between Europe, US, and China. Also the digital domain, which I think will also be crucial in those relations, in this triangle. And that's not so easy to make the EU and US perspectives the same. As you mentioned, the digital tax that probably will be a sticking point in those relations. And also the investment agreement, which is unfolding story for 7 years, I think. So it's definitely a carrot, but we'll see if the EU will finally get it or not. We'll see. This year probably not, but we'll see how to what extent China will use it in the future. So now I will pass the floor to Justyna for her introductory remarks. Please, Justyna.
Thank you, Damian. Good afternoon, all of you. It's great to see you, Teresa, via Zoom. I do hope that after the pandemic we can meet face to face. Because Teresa presented and answered the question about the EU-China relations, the state of play, the challenges, and so on, and also the impact of US elections on EU-China relations. So I do not want to repeat what Teresa has already said, but I would like to offer, let's say, Chinese perspective, if I may, and try to combine the first and the second topic of our discussion, I mean EU-China relations and impact of US elections on EU-China relations. So I would like to start from defining China's goals when it comes to China-EU relations. I think that there are two main goals that China would like to achieve having relations with the EU. The first one is to maintain the status quo before, let's say, EU-China strategic outlook agenda, which means that what China really appreciates is open Europe for China economically, and silent Europe when it comes to human rights and other sensitive issues for China. So it's Chinese, let's say, two goals when it comes to EU-China relations. But the second important goal is is connected to the EU-US, especially since Trump administration and his, let's say, anti-Chinese policy, which is to prevent US, EU, or transatlantic cooperation against China or against Beijing. And when you look at what is going on right now in the EU when it comes to, let's say, sharpen EU's China policy, but also Trump administration policy, but now the victory of Joe Biden and possibilities of closer transatlantic cooperation, focusing also on China, I think that there is a big failure for China that the PRC could not achieve those two goals. Now, I would like to very briefly look at EU-China relations and some prospects of transatlantic relations when it comes to China. So when you look at what is going on right now in Europe, we can say that it's a really tense and difficult relations, mainly due to US sharpened policy towards China. As Teresa said about this three perception of China, which is partner, economic competitor, and systemic rival. China really doesn't like this, especially the systemic rival notion. Is trying is asking us, I mean EU, to define what it means and so on. What EU is trying to do is to redefine this reciprocity notion and to introduce very long list of defensive measures. And China accuses us of being protectionist. EU is becoming really outspoken when it comes to sensitive issues for China, international law, human rights, Xinjiang, Tibet, Hong Kong, and so on. So in that sense, at the political level is rising distrust. At the economic level, still there is a problems unsolved about market access, level playing field, industrial subsidies, forced technology transfer, and so on. And what is really interesting is China's reaction. Recently, it's really interesting that China organizes in the last, let's say, 3-4 weeks, conferences about EU-China ties. I attended 2 conferences in the last three weeks. And what China is trying to convince us that our relation is very good. They are trying to some extent say that everything is okay. The tensions that are taking place right now is because EU is focusing more on ideology, but situation is great. Our relation is perfect, especially when the Chinese expert trying to compare it with the US. So I think it's the best example that China is really afraid of what is going on in Europe when it comes to China. Now I would like to focus on this transatlantic relations, because even under Trump, at the end of just before the elections, EU and US launched, let's say, some dialogue on China. So now, after Biden's victory, I think that what is China really afraid of is a transatlantic cooperation on China. And to be honest, it is the topic that is pretty noticeable during these meetings with Chinese experts in the last 2, 3, or 4 weeks. And when you look at the, as Teresa said about yesterday's proposal from the EU proposal on strengthening relations with the US, despite the fact that there is no any sentence about China, when we look at the content, I think it's the content is exactly what China is really afraid of, because it's first of all, EU presents itself as a strong actor, initiator of improving ties with the US. EU wants to cooperate with the US on climate issues, including green tech technologies, on high-tech, artificial intelligence, 5G, and so on, but also on values, strengthening democracy. So all these topics that are sensitive for China. So so I think that it is this proposal for strengthening relations with the US shows that the second goal of China's China's goal when it comes to relations with the EU is really difficult to achieve. And as a final remark, I would like to offer you China's a few points about Chinese arguments. What is going on right now in the transatlantic relations, because what China is trying to do is to play down the importance of the fact that EU and US are trying to strengthen their relations. So after reading some articles about EU-China relations after Biden's victory, I would like to offer you some points from Chinese point of view. The first one is that the fact that China, EU and China and US would like to strengthen cooperation because the Western world is really afraid of China. So the first point. The second is that there is no guarantee that all 27 member states will be on the same page. So in that sense, China hopes for lack of consensus within the EU as in previous time, but recently we can see that it's more coordination and more unity within the EU when it comes to China. And of course, China also mentions Brexit that caused many internal frictions. So there are some problems within the EU. Teresa said about the honeymoon between the US and the EU, and China also uses this phrase. They are talking about the honeymoon, but focusing on the fact that it will not be easy to have the honeymoon for a very long period. And of course, Chinese economy and technological developments are great, and EU economic dependence on China means that China is really important partner for the EU. Chinese experts also say that US-EU disputes are structural, so they are not very easy to be solved. And it's impossible for the EU to form a real anti-Chinese alliance because of the EU's dependence on China when it comes on economic area. EU's stance is not anti-Chinese, different story when it comes to the US. And this EU's draft on strengthening transatlantic relations is rather a political goodwill to the US because US does not want yesterday to be repeated. And what is possible, what is the concept from the Chinese side is that, of course, China could expect more transatlantic pressure on values norms like human rights, Xinjiang, Tibet, and Hong Kong. So this is the Chinese official language. I think that it is the best example that China is really afraid of strengthening transatlantic relations. And it is also, to my last sentence, that EU-China policy, the sharpened ones, works. So I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Justyna, for presenting Chinese perspective, which is sometimes not well known in Europe. Chinese hopes, but also Chinese fears. As we see, there are a lot of them, and we'll see in the coming months and years if some of them will fulfill and what will be the China's reaction. Thank you very much for your presentations. Now we'll get to the Q&A session. I would like also only to remind our viewers that you can constantly ask questions on YouTube and our other platforms. I will gather them later and ask those questions to our participants. So don't hesitate to put your questions in the chat box. My first question would be about strictly the US-China relations under Biden. Probably they will create a space for EU to act. We'll see how much space there will be. And Joseph Nye describes the US-China relations in recent years as a cooperative rivalry. So I'd like to ask you, how much do you see perspectives for cooperation and how much there will be a rivalry in the US-China relations and how it can affect the space for maneuver for the EU in the coming years? So maybe we'll start with Teresa.
So just to make sure I understand your question, how will this create a space for EU to act in the future between this kind of rivalry between the US and China?
Yes, how much there will be, in your opinion, a cooperation and how much there will be a rivalry between US and China? As I can imagine, that will also make, create a space. It will be a small space, maybe a bigger one. To what extent the Biden administration would like to cooperate, which we didn't see much during the Trump's tenure, and how many there will be a rivalry? How EU will have to present themselves and position itself in this context?
The most recent interview I saw with President-elect Biden was the Friedman article in the New York Times, and it made President-elect Biden made it very clear that there would not be much change in how he's dealing with China as compared to Trump, but he hopes to create more concrete changes instead of maybe some of these erratic tariffs. He wants to see real change in regard to tech transfer, stealing of technology, and of course, reciprocity, open, same request that Europe has actually. And so we see a lot of competition with China, and people I think tend to forget because there's this whole narrative taking place now about strategic decoupling from areas that no country should be reliant on China, because as we saw with mask diplomacy, the Chinese were willing to weaponize a mask. Can you imagine, so if there's any silver lining of this whole COVID-19 pandemic is that it has woken the world up to over-dependence on China. So in one of the largest markets in Europe, we see Germany talk about diversifying. And as Justina pointed out in the paper that was just released yesterday, the Europeans are so good about this, about tiptoeing and never saying the word China. So they do this in statements, they do this in papers, they never want to say China. And just as an aside, we see a difference in EU member states because it's an EU member state competence. For example, on their decisions on Huawei, they can only be given guidelines from Brussels. So a country like Sweden that said that we will ban Huawei, then Huawei turns around and sues them. But if you kind of tiptoe around it carefully, like France did, for example, saying untrusted vendors will not be able to supply our future 5G technology, so it doesn't name China. So this is a very interesting European approach, I think. But going back to US-China relations and areas of cooperation, I think Biden has made it clear he wants to work on climate issues. So, but he's not going to make that the only area because I think this idea of putting aside everything to cooperate on climate or North Korea is not in anyone's interest, and China tries to weaponize that. It always likes to have dialogue on these issues in order to slow things down. So I think we've seen in the recent Department of Defense paper released in September, there's great concern about China's growing military footprint. Europe, at the NATO meeting yesterday, Jens Stoltenberg pointed out that China has weapons that can make it all the way to Europe. So it's not a theoretical question any longer. China's reach is very far. So I think that Europe will try to carve out some space in all of this. I think they hate the narrative of great power competition because where does Europe fit in there? A year ago now, with the new Ursula von der Leyen Commission presidency, she declared that they will be a geopolitical commission. So if you think about it, isn't it odd that they thought they never did geopolitics? Because I've heard on many occasions, European bureaucrats declare we don't do geopolitics. And looking at the world only through an economic lens is quite convenient because you don't have to take on, the impact of selling, silent diesel submarine engines to the PLA in China, as a German company did. So saying, we don't do geopolitics kind of also removed European actions, for example, renting dredgers that helped create 7 artificial islands in the South China Sea. So they never really thought of the repercussions of their actions because it was both a German company and a Belgian company that the Chinese rented these massive dredgers from. So I think that the US will expect Europe to be a little more on board. And this idea of equidistance, I think, has been put to bed. Europe, some analysts in Europe tried to describe the relationship as equidistance between China and the US, that Europe was trying to find a middle way. But we saw with High Representative Joseph Borrell's recent blog that no, we share values with the United States. We share a history. We have over 70 years of an alliance that we need, so they tend to lean towards the US, but the US is their #1 trade partner, with China second. So they have to figure out a way to work with them. So I think the idea of strategic decoupling will be key, and to diversify. And as we also saw under the German presidency, this idea of Indo-Pacific guidelines. They didn't even use the word strategy so as not to upset China. So this idea of, there was a lot of hyperbole around it initially in the press. For example, Bloomberg declared it Germany's divorce from China, but it's more, there's no word of China in it, but they tend to talk about diversifying, showing an interest in this region, and working closer with ASEAN. So I think Europe is moving ahead on a lot of issues. So it remains to be seen how China will respond, because they have been making economic threats. And if we look at the example of Australia, what's happening in Australia, and the list of 14 grievances, and the type of economic coercion that Australia is suffering, for example, 212% tariff on wine, because what did Australia do? They asked for, one of the issues that really upset Beijing was that they asked for an independent inquiry into the origins of COVID-19. So is the international community really going to stand up, or is it going to really fall foul of China's economic coercion, as we're seeing now in Australia? So I think among the 14 grievances was the inquiry into COVID-19. The other was banning Huawei. So these are issues that I think what we see happening in Australia is a canary in the coal mine for what could happen in Europe, and if China really decides to play hardball with other European economies.
Thank you very much. So Justyna, your perception, how much cooperation, how much rivalry between US and China under Biden, and what does it mean for the EU?
Well, it's a very difficult question, Damian. But if I may, to be once again China's voice here during this our seminar, so I would like to offer you, and to be honest, I agree with many of Chinese assessments, that China is aware that under Biden, generally speaking, the substance of US policy towards China will not change. The style may change. So when you look what Chinese experts are talking or writing about possibilities about US-China relations under Biden administration, first of all, they are saying that it is difficult to imagine that Biden could be more tough on China than Trump, because Trump was so tough. So what China is expecting from Biden is that his administration could be or will be more professional, less emotional, comparing to the Trump administration. And in that sense, Biden may offer a room for talks or some negotiations. So there could be some negotiations and talks between China and the US. What China is also talking about is that Biden will focus more on competition with China rather than full-scale decoupling. So this is the idea that China has analyzing what is going on within Biden's administration. And and you asked Damian about the role of the EU And what China is talking about is what China appreciates when it comes to the EU is the strategic autonomy concept, EU's strategic autonomy concept. And China appreciates this concept and believes that this concept will be still valid because it means that EU, maybe in another way, China perceives EU's strategic autonomy concept mainly through the prism of transatlantic relations. I think that is a kind of a trap that China is not aware of, is the fact that EU strategic autonomy concept is also the idea of being more self-efficient, not dependent not only on China but on other markets. So I think that China really appreciates the strategic autonomy, but does not notice that it could be also something difficult for EU-China cooperation. So it's really difficult to say about this room for maneuvering for the EU. Of course, the best option, I think, is to cooperate with the US and to find some topics that we could cooperate together when it comes to China. But what China really waiting for is the fact that because of many structural problems between the US and China and the EU, this cooperation will not be very let's say strong, if I may put it in this way.
Thank you very much. So we see that many elements from the previous administration will remain, maybe, as Justyna mentioned, in the different style, and probably that's what the Chinese side also hopes for. We got some questions from the audience, so maybe I will read maybe two of them. Kartik Ashta asks about the possible transatlantic Indo-Pacific policy. As Teresa mentioned, that Germany recently published their strategy on the Indo-Pacific region. Do you see that there is a possibility of the common transatlantic strategy policy on the whole Indo-Pacific? And the second question from our colleague from PISM, Marcin Przychodniak, our China analyst, a little bit in the context of what Teresa said about Australia. Do you see the current Chinese policy toward Australia as a test for Biden in order to check his willingness to react as a new US leader? And what is important, to what extent EU and US should support Australia? So both those questions I direct to our both panelists. So maybe in a different order now, I will ask Justyna to start.
Okay. Very difficult questions once again. About Indo-Pacific, I think that now, because we have this Indo-Pacific strategy, US Indo-Pacific strategy, we do not have EU Indo-Pacific strategy, but we have those kind of strategies in several member states. For me, it's really difficult to say if there is a possibility to have the strategy as a, let's say, as a document, to have some joint strategy between US and EU on Indo-Pacific strategy. But I think that it's the cooperation with the Asian countries is a really important issue. And also, once again, being a China's voice, China is really afraid of Biden's and EU's closer cooperation with other Asian countries, and this is also a signal that could be some difficulties in US-China relations, but also EU-China relations. 2 or 3 days ago, there was information that EU and ASEAN upgraded its relation to strategic partnership. So it is another signal that for the EU, other Asian countries, not only China, are very important. So in that sense, I think that this strengthening cooperation with Asian countries is a fact, and it's really reason for China to be afraid of. But it's really difficult to answer if there is a possible to have a joint Indo-Pacific strategy, transatlantic Indo-Pacific strategy. About the second question about the Australia, if it's a test for Biden, well, I'm not sure if a test for Biden. I think there's another step for China's war for diplomacy. And of course, we have the Trump as a president in the White House. What about reactions from the EU? As we are democracies, I think that just we should support the Australia, especially as we know what China is doing, publishing some fake news or fake photos in the Twitter or Facebook, which is really ridiculous, and it's difficult to remove this fake information that China is using our social media. We could not, as democracies, to have similar publications, and I'm not talking about fake news, but some publications to inform Chinese society about what is going on. So I think it's really, there's no really reciprocity. So of course, if it's a question about our reactions, we should just support democracies, and of course focusing on the truth, and say that fake news is really bad issues, is the example of Chinese disinformation.
Thank you, Stena. So Teresa, common transatlantic Indo-Pacific strategy, is it possible? And Australia as a test for Biden, and how the West, EU, US should or not support Australia, to what extent they should engage?
I think it might be very difficult to coordinate a transatlantic Indo-Pacific strategy, but I have to add that Europe is making great strides in this region. For example, the first time I heard about this was when I was at the Shangri-La Dialogue. I think it was about 2016. French Minister Le Drian had announced that he wanted to see an EU approach to this region. It didn't really get much traction. It got a rather negative article in The Economist. In 2018, France publicized their own Indo-Pacific strategy, and there was really no movement. And now that Germany has published guidelines, it has gotten a lot more traction because of Germany's economic ties to China. And I think what's really important here to remember is, the baggage that some of this language carries, because there was a real reluctance in Brussels to even use the term Indo-Pacific. For example, 2 years ago, I was asked to organize a conference, and I had all these people lined up to speak, and some EU officials had to cancel at the last minute because they weren't allowed to speak at anything with Indo-Pacific. So I learned that lesson the hard way, and I was really glad to see that the Germans actually embraced the term Indo-Pacific. And even a German think tank had advised not to use this term, that they thought it had too much American baggage. Nevertheless, the current German government chose to use the term Indo-Pacific, which I think sends a very important signal. And this kind of idea originated with Abe, Japanese Prime Minister Abe. So he called it FOIP, Free and Open Indo-Pacific. We're seeing that being tinkered with a bit now with the new Biden administration, but it's still going to be around. And I think Europeans are always wary of tying their truck to the US too tightly. So they try to emphasize that it is different than the United States and its policy. And they are also trying to emphasize the idea of connectivity, because the EU connectivity strategy, as a German MEP recently stated, that it's like a car with no wheels. So by looking at the Indo-Pacific through also this connectivity strategy, they hope to increase that, but also diversify and give help to other countries in the region without ever talking about China. So I am hopeful. So then quickly after the Germans announced the Indo-Pacific guidelines, it was followed by the Netherlands. So all three countries, France, Germany, and the Netherlands, brought their proposals to the EU, and they said, please work on this. And they're expecting actually a paper on this in March. So for EU standards, this is actually moving quite rapidly. And this was one of the goals of the German Council presidency. So I think that this is something, as Justina said, Beijing doesn't like to see. One of their key strategies is to weaken the transatlantic alliance, and to have kind of similar policies is something they don't like to see. In regard to Australia, as a test for Biden, I think, China has spent millions on public diplomacy, and yet they turn around and do all these things, which makes everyone horrified with what we saw in Hong Kong, what we're seeing now, of course, Tibet, Xinjiang, threats towards Taiwan, but now, Australia, which is a big trading partner of China. And as Justina pointed out, using this kind of disinformation campaign on a Chinese government Twitter account, I mean, it's really appalling. So I think that they're constantly probing for international response. And I would say the EU pretty much dropped the ball in Hong Kong, because when they had the FAC meeting of Foreign Affairs Committee, out of the 27 EU member states, only one had suggested sanctions, and that was Sweden. So yes, Europe is worried about values, but when it really comes down to money or possibly upsetting Beijing, they kind of hold back a bit. And another example in regard to how this alliance of democracies, which I think the Biden administration is going to try to give more life to, is that, for example, in the UN, a German ambassador had initiated a statement about what was happening in Xinjiang, and 35 countries signed on to that. So to respond to that, a Cuban ambassador introduced a statement, and 45 countries signed on to that, saying that, Xinjiang is China's business, we should stay out of it. So I think that on the international stage, if Europe really cares about values, and the rest of the democracies, they really are going to have to work together, because freedom and values are rapidly eroding. China is an authoritarian power with great economic heft. And I think we really have to start thinking far more strategically. So definitely Australia is a member of Five Eyes. They should be supported. I'm on Twitter. There's a whole Twitter campaign for people to drink Australian wine during the holidays. It's just a symbolic thing, really, but it's, I hope that we'll see far more serious support, and people are going to have to start making, and governments are going to have to start making tough decisions. And in a post-COVID-19 really desperate economic landscape, what are the trade-offs going to be, and will governments be willing to make them?
Thank you very much. So those trade-offs in the post-COVID world would be very interesting, to what extent countries will be willing to engage. If someone would like to support Australia, then we can drink Australian wine. That's one of the conclusions, I think. Two more questions from our audience. The first one from Grzegorz Stec. Do you think that Beijing's anxiety over reinvigoration of EU-US cooperation may push it to make meaningful concessions given the investment agreement? Given also the prospects of implementing the dual circulation concept in the Chinese economy, which we haven't talked about, but it's also very, I think, meaningful factor in the EU-China relations. So this is the first question, and the second one, our colleague from PiSM, Agnieszka Lewucka, asked about the possible cooperation with Russia to reduce China's power. Is it possible under Biden administration? What do you think about this this possibility? So Teresa, maybe we'll start with you.
Okay, so in regard to dual circulation, can you just repeat the very first question? Sorry.
The first one was about the reinvigorating cooperation between the EU and US. Is there a potential to make China make some concessions in terms of investment agreement because of this cooperation, and maybe to, undermine it a little bit. And also in terms of, or in the context of this dual circulation concept, which can be implemented in the next 5 years.
Okay, I think that there's a huge hope here in Brussels that Beijing will eventually cut a deal with them, and that Europe tends to like to arbitrage the difference between the US and China. But you have to keep in mind, whatever Beijing grants to Europe, the US is going to ask for the same thing. And so I think that this is very wishful thinking on the part of Europeans. And most people here think that they're just being played along by Beijing. They promised all this and it's not going to happen. They keep making nice noises, but it's not going to happen. And so the US trade officials are watching extremely carefully. So whatever is granted to Europe, the US will also have to have. And I think Europeans want reform of the World Trade Organization. That was one of the requests they made yesterday to the new Biden administration. So, we'll see how this works out, because China is not in compliance with many WTO rules and regulations. So this is a sticking point for everybody. And this idea of dual circulation, it's kind of old wine in new bottles. I mean, China has always wanted to be more independent of the world economy. And we saw in 2008 with the financial crisis, they saw that as an external threat to them. And so they wanted to become far more independent. So when they talk about decoupling, actually they've been doing it since then. There is no Amazon, there is no Google, there is no Wikipedia, there's no New York Times, there's no Bloomberg. All these things, China has decoupled from. So they have already started decoupling over a decade ago. And I think that this idea that it's almost a paradox, Europe expects more access to China when they're actually trying to become less reliant on the rest of the world. So China's strategy is to make the world more reliant on them, at the same time becoming less reliant on the rest of the world, as Xi Jinping announced at the last meeting. So I think that European strategists, or they should think far more strategically and listen to what Beijing is saying, because I think they keep asking for the same thing for over 7 years, and the landscape has changed.
On the possible cooperation with Russia on China, what can you say about this?
Okay, that's a perennial one. Macron had this idea. Well, the thing is, obviously, Moscow likes working with Beijing. They're clearly the junior partner in this relationship. I think, everyone thinks they're mini Kissinger here, that they can pull Russia in and balance China. But I think that is really a false narrative. And I think that eventually, under its own power, under own pressure, China and Russia will pull apart, but there's no way that other countries are going to be able to do that. And I think, I was thinking about that today, Moscow has agreed to work with Huawei in Russia. And I really wonder, that they're like riding a tiger. How is this going to affect Russia's long-term interests? So I think what we saw happen in Belarus, this whole region, Central and Eastern Europe, China's Belt and Road Initiative, I think this must be of great concern for Putin. And I think that the less people try to get involved in this relationship, it will just naturally deteriorate under its own power. Otherwise, it's just, I think that's a wrong route to go down, because the one thing that China and Russia do have in common is that they like to undermine these institutions. It's a question of how to do it. Both China and Russia are, they don't like the EU, they don't like NATO. So I think that they have a lot more in common than many people like to think about.
Thank you. Riding a tiger, that could be a dangerous game. So Russia has to keep it in mind. Justina, the floor.
Okay, I will try to be very brief about the first question about these possible concessions that China could make for the EU because of Biden's administration and possible closer ties between US and the EU. Well, and also combining this question with this main conclusions from the last plenum, Central Committee, and this very, let's say now, widely promoted slogan of dual circulation. For me, it's really difficult to combine it, because dual circulation means that, generally speaking, it is said that dual circulation means that China is preparing for decoupling, especially when it comes to these technological issues, or high-tech and these technological issues, because this is what you can read from the communique after the plenum. So in that sense, if China would like to close itself and to be more self-efficient, focusing on internal market, it means that maybe there is no possibility for some concessions when it comes to investment agreement with the EU. So in that sense, I do not think that we could expect concessions. What China is learning lessons from the past, we can say that China offers concessions not to the EU as a whole, as a bloc, but mostly to selected countries, mostly to Germany. So I'm not sure, and to be honest, I'm really skeptical if there is a possibility to conclude negotiations on a comprehensive agreement on investment. This year we have only one month left, so I do not think that there is a possibility, especially that EU is pretty outspoken when it comes to this agreement. We are talking about the substance, not about the time, and we would like to be a player, not a playing field. So this is the fact that the ball is in the Chinese court. So I'm certainly very skeptical about possibilities of conclusion of these negotiations. And the question from Agnieszka, as I understood correct, I'm not sure if I understood correctly, but Agnieszka asked if there is a possibility of cooperation between US and Russia against China to reduce China's power. I really do hope that there is no such a possibility. To be honest, I was really afraid during Trump administration that Trump would like to cooperate with Russia against China. But as we know, looking at some strategic documents of the US, Russia and China were perceived or are perceived as main rival or threat. So I do hope that the Biden administration, which focuses also on values, democratic values, international law, and so on, that this administration will not cooperate with authoritarian Russia against authoritarian China. So this is my predictions and my hopes.
Thank you very much, Justyna. We are running out of time, so we'll have to conclude our discussions. Thank you for your interventions, for your remarks. I think maybe it's obvious, but EU-China relations will remain complex and probably will remain very tough in coming months and years. And also the cooperation with the US, as you mentioned, both there is a place for common actions. There are values which both sides share, but also that will depend on the development of the situation in the post-COVID world, the issue of navigating those relations between US and the EU, and also to make those common stances towards China, or the interest towards China, more applicable to reality. And we'll take a close look at the development of the situation in coming months. So thank you very much. Thank you, the audience, for your questions. And I hope the discussion was interesting and fruitful for you. And I pass the floor to Łukasz for the concluding remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Damian. Indeed, it was really fascinating. I would like to also thank to our panelists, to you, Damian. It was really well and smoothly moderated. I would like to also thank to our staff for organizing this interesting debate. In particular, Magdalena Markiewicz, who is at the Brussels office project coordinator, who also specializes on China. So just to say that in the future, we're going to discuss more about this very specific relation between EU and China with this transatlantic angle. And please stay tuned for the following events. Follow us on our Twitter account, on the website. We publish a lot on these issues. as Damian said, when you take on board for the discussion EU-China relations with the US, you talk about global issues, global affairs, and we've been working a lot on these issues, and we will discuss it very often from the Polish and also from the Central European perspective. So I hope, Teresa, one more time, thank you for your cooperation, that we will organize some more events on these questions, and we will talk very soon. So thank you all, and see you next time. Bye-bye.